Welcome to the book club where the size is just right, the books aren't too long, and you never need to host. That's our job. We bring best-selling and award-winning writers of every genre to Twin Cities metro area libraries to share their stories, discuss their work, and answer those burning questions you've always wanted to ask your favorite authors. This is a book club where we don't have to argue about what the author meant. They can tell us. The book club that doesn't require a clean house or wine and cheese. And in this book club, if you haven't read the book, it's all right. Although, we hope you'll be inspired to pick it up next time you're in the library. I'm your host, Slade Kemet, and you can consider the book club rewritten because this is Club Book. Club Book is made possible by Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, MELSA, and Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. We would also like to thank our partnering bookseller, Red Balloon Bookshop. This podcast features Emiko Jean at St. Paul Public Library, Merriam Park. Emiko Jean is an accomplished young adult writer, best known for the New York Times bestselling Tokyo Ever After and its sequel, Tokyo Dreaming. Described as the Princess Diaries for a new generation, Jean's series follows Japanese-American teenager Izumi Tanaka, a self-professed outsider who discovers that her long-absent father is the Crown Prince of Japan. Reese Witherspoon selected Tokyo Ever After as a Reese's Book Club pick in 2021. Jean's adult debut, Mika in Real Life, centers around a directionless, down-on-her-luck woman who is unexpectedly contacted by the daughter she gave up for adoption. Marie Claire calls it a truly poignant coming-of-age story that deals with race, adoption, and bodily autonomy. Mika in Real Life was a Good Morning America book club selection in August 2022. Jean's follow-up is a psychological thriller, The Return of Ellie Black. Detective Chelsey Calhoun is often tasked with finding missing girls, but is thunderstruck when young Ellie turns up mysteriously in the woods, a full 2 years after her sudden disappearance.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today, and thank you for that really great introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here this evening to talk about my book, The Return of Ellie Black. I've written in the YA space, as was mentioned, and in the adult space, and if you're familiar with my work, before Ellie Black, they tend to be on the lighter side. So my YA novels, Tokyo Ever After and Tokyo Dreaming, are kind of these frothy modern-day fairy tales / romantic comedies that center around identity. And Mika in Real Life, my debut adult novel, is about transracial adoption and the complex bonds between mothers and daughters. But it's still a funny, kind of heartwarming read. So why Ellie Black? Why this kind of dark, intense thriller? And the answer is because it's always been there. Ellie Black is a book nearly a decade in the making. For those of you who are familiar with Mike Tyson, he once said, "You have a plan until you get hit in the face." And Ellie Black was my hit in the face novel. I wrote it in 2017 as part of a 2-book deal. And the intention was for it to follow my debut YA novel, a thriller called We'll Never Be Apart. And so I drafted Ellie Black, and I sent it to my editor with just these illusions of grandeur. I thought that it was the best thing that I'd ever written, and fame was sure to follow. And I also thought after you signed a publishing deal that you would never face rejection again. That was a thing of the past, and I would never face any sort of rejection. And then my editor passed on it. She said that the book wasn't for her, and it wasn't suitable for a young adult audience, which was true. But of course, I didn't see that at the time. I just became totally unhinged. And I had a phone call with my agent, and it basically went I'm dying, and then she was like, "You're not dying," and then I was like, "Well, I'm never writing something again," and she said, "Write something else now," and then she paused and she said, "You're contractually obligated. You owe the publisher another book." So, which I found really compelling. I found legally compelling. So I went on to write more books, and But Ellie Black was always like this book that I kept on my desktop, and it was kind of my affair book. So I'd go back to her and I'd be like, I still want you, I still think you're beautiful, I still think, like this could be something. And then the pandemic hit and I kept asking my agent, I'd be like, when is it time for Ellie Black? And she'd say, there's a global pandemic, nobody wants to buy thrillers right now. So, but eventually that all ended and we sold Ellie Black, and here we are today. It's a published book, which feels so good. So a little bit about Ellie Black. The story starts with Chelsey Calhoun, who is a small-town Japanese-American police detective, and she receives a phone call that Ellie Black, a teen who went missing more than 2 years ago without leaving a trace, has resurfaced in the woods of Washington State. And now Chelsey finally has a chance to solve the cold case that has never stopped haunting her. But even though Ellie is no longer in harm's way, Chelsey's investigation is anything but open and shut. She has far more questions than answers. Who took Ellie Black and why won't Ellie talk about her experience? As Chelsey digs deeper into Ellie's history and her recent behavior, which seems suspicious, Chelsey runs headlong into demons of her own, unresolved grief over her murdered sister, and the subsequent fracturing of her family. The novel is told primarily from Chelsey's point of view, but you also get flashes of perspectives from those close to Ellie and a first-hand account from Ellie herself. At its core, it's a book about family secrets, survival, and finding hope after trauma. And this evening, I'd love to chat with you more about the inspiration behind the book and the elements that provide the emotional underpinnings. But before that, I'm going to read the prologue to kick us off. This is how it begins, with a girl running through a forest, her veins tight with adrenaline. She exhales in short, even bursts. There is dirt under her fingers, fresh mud stains on her jeans, blood on her sweatshirt, and vomit on her breath. Soon she will be home. Images surface, the one stoplight on Main Street, the chipped green shutters of her house, the weathered flooring of her father's commercial fishing boat. In the distance, a horn blares, and she ducks, covering her ears, the sound slicing through her skull like an anguished scream. The world shrinks and becomes abstract, too colorful and too bright. The horn recedes, and the trees slowly refocus. She counts her breaths as her heartbeat steadies. 1, 2, 3. Then she counts her steps. 4, 5, 6. How many will it take for someone to find her? 7, 8, 9. Her bones are heavy, her feet tired. She has traveled a long distance. Her shadow stretches ahead of her as if she's chasing it. Come and catch me. 10, 11, 12. Her body wavers. Maybe she should sit down. 13, 14, 15. She pushes herself to keep going. The sun rises higher behind the gray clouds. The air smells of pine and resin, like water and moss, like life itself. Hey, are you all right? A pair of hikers, father and son, appear rounding the corner of the trail. They wear overstuffed backpacks, rolled sleeping bags at the top, a pot hanging from the bottom of one, 2 metal cups from the other. The girl slows her pace and draws closer to them. 16, 17, 18. The father places an arm across his son's chest to shield him from the girl, and she falters, caught in the chokehold of their gazes. The son's eyes are brown with tiny flecks of gold, and they remind her of someone she used to know. Her mind tumbles and trips back in time. Tell me what you would do for someone you love. Anything. I would do anything. The father clears his throat. Miss, are you all right? He studies her. She imagines what he sees: filthy skin, tangled hair, bony body, blood-stained sweatshirt. She is something the world has chewed up and spit out. The son's nose twitches. Miss, the father says with more force this time. He takes a single tentative step toward her. The girl licks her dry, cracked lips and works to keep her voice steady as she answers, yes? Are you all right, the father asks again. The girl blinks, shakes her head, stares into nothing. No, I don't think I am. What's your name? My name. Who is she? Who has she become? A vessel to be carried, to be kept, to be filled. Yes, what's your name? The father drags the words out. The girl hesitates. Her name is stuck somewhere inside of her, down in the deep, deep dark where she hid it. To be safe. Don't remember, never forget. She squares her shoulders and reaches for it. Elizabeth, she says on a whoosh of breath. She has not spoken those 4 syllables in forever. Her name, her real name, the name her mother picked because it was classic and royal and carried all her hopes and dreams for her daughter. College, career, a family, happiness. Once the girl had worn her name proudly like a crown. Once someone whispered her name back to her, love on their tongue. With a final twist, the girl wrenches her whole name free. My name is Elizabeth Black. I think I'm missing. So that's the beginning of the book. And it was actually, and it's the original inspiration behind the novel. That's the scene that I saw when I first thought about drafting the novel and thought about the story. And it was basically just about a kidnapped victim who returns, and I didn't have much more than that idea. But this prologue lasted through at least 24 revisions, which is rare to have a piece of writing kind of emerge fully intact after it's been gutted by editors. So, and I find it just as captivating now as I did 7+ years ago when I started writing the book, which is also rare because usually when I'm getting toward the end point of a book, I usually turn on it and I start to really, really hate it. But this opening always kind of stayed true and fresh to me, and I still like it. And I think I know why. How many of us have been drawn to stories, fiction or real life, of kidnapped victims who have returned? Stories, real life stories like Amanda Berry's and J.C. Duggar's, or fictional ones like Ellie Black's, and why? Why do we want to read, watch, listen to, or in my case, write something like Ellie Black? What is so fascinating about these tales? Or as my mother says, are you okay? I am okay, and I want to assure all of you who enjoy the same type of content that you're okay too. I believe there are really very real reasons why I and others gravitate towards narratives like this. And it has to do with the themes behind these stories, the elements that kept me interested in this particular story for 7+ years. And they say a lot about who we are as a people and who we are as a society. So the first and most prominent and most obvious is fascination with true crime. In this country, we have an obsession with true crime, especially women. True crime audiences and readers of dark thrillers like mine are predominantly women. I think the number is about 85% of true crime consumers is women. Yeah. And there's a psychological force at hand here driving women towards stories like this. Women are the most likely to be the victims of these types of crimes. And for me, I believe I deeply empathize with the protagonists and more. There's an article by Amelia Anthony where she said, women have a pervasive fear of gendered violence and they consume true crime so they can understand and prevent violence in their own lives. So this feels very true to me, and I can tell it feels true to some of the audience members too. And I've absorbed stories like this, and I've always had a running commentary in my head too, like silently remarking on what I would have done differently in similar circumstances. I would have done this. I never would have let them take me to a second location. And giving over easily to this kind of victim blaming and hindsight bias, this trap of looking back at an unpredictable event and thinking it was easily predictable. In the book, Ellie wrestles with this same notion, the idea that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, and that she should have been smarter, that she should have fought harder. Side note, Ellie is very much modeled after me as a teen, who was less than a model student, and if we have time in the Q&A, I'll tell you guys about when I was arrested in high school, but we'll get back to the book. So in the book, Ellie uses her sister's ID to buy alcohol, to rent a motel room, to throw a party, and she charges at the door because she wants to buy a new phone. And all of these actions have Ellie wondering, and maybe the reader too, if she deserved what happened to her. Another element, and something else that just kept me interested in this story for all these years, is survival. How did this person, someone like Ellie Black, endure and eventually prevail? Really, these are gruesome heroes' stories. Against all odds, this person survived. I think there's a razor-sharp hope to be found layered under all of this darkness. And survival is the steel core of Ellie Black and is embodied in all of the characters. The most obvious is Ellie and how she adapts to her circumstances, how she tries to gather resources and allies. But survival is also part of Chelsey's story. She's the detective whose sister was murdered and was forced to weather the fracturing of her family. Each character in the book, in their own way, navigates the landscape of their grief, searching for a way out, a way to survive not only physically, but also emotionally. Even the setting in Ellie Black lends itself to this element of survival. The novel takes place in a fictional small town on the Washington coast called Coldwell, but it's very much inspired by a real coastal town in Washington called Long Beach. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the geography of Washington, but Long Beach is a very thin strip of land, and it juts out into the water, so it's surrounded by water on all three sides. So there's only one way in and one way out. And the entire town sits on the edge of the Cascadia subduction zone, which was made famous by a 2015 New Yorker article called The Really Big One, which said that the Pacific Northwest and parts of California were due for a catastrophic earthquake. Yeah, I'm seeing people nod. It was terrifying for us living in the region. There'd be this big earthquake in which buildings would crumble and a large tsunami would ensue, wiping out the coastline and submerging towns like Long Beach, i.e. Coldwell, under 11 feet of water. So I liked how isolated Long Beach was for the setting of this book. I chose to rename it Coldwell because that allowed me to play with the landscape a little bit more and create kind of more economic differences in it. But the weather can be severe, and so can the ocean. I interviewed a resident there who said they grew up and they were warned never to turn their back on the tide. And so within this setting, there's this constant existential threat that looms. And as Ellie puts it in the book, we are hardwired to live. No matter how much you will your heart to seize its gentle beating, it will endure. So paired with this element of survival is a big mystery. The question of how did this person survive? Who took Ellie Black and why? And curiosity is in our DNA. We are innately driven to seek, to find, and to solve. And I think we all love the adrenaline rush that comes with these types of stories too, which varies from anxious to nervous to excitement. Books and true crime are a safe place to traverse the landscape of our fears, all from the comfort of our own homes. And there is also the promise of catharsis at the end. The last thing I'm going to speak about is what eventually became the heart of the novel, an element that I didn't see fully taking shape until the late stages of the book, and that is ambiguous loss. It wasn't something that I was familiar with before I started drafting the book, but in writing the book, I was fortunate enough to interview detectives, victims, families of victims, and even a tuna fisherman, which is probably why there's this very long description of a boat in chapter 6. It's 6 paragraphs long. But what struck me the most when researching families with missing children who have not returned is this ambiguous loss. In the book, Ellie Black comes home, but so many others don't, and I wanted to explore what is left behind when we can't say goodbye. The book's original title was If You Leave Me, and it's a modified line from a song, Keep Me in Your Heart by Warren Zevon, if any of you are familiar with Jewish folk singers. And in the song, Zevon sings, I am tied to you like the buttons on your blouse. And I thought it was such a beautiful statement juxtaposed against absence and this lack of closure, that there might be an invisible tether, that even in emptiness, something remains. So I'm going to end here by saying it's okay to like these types of stories. Actually, it's more than okay. It's a way for us to grapple with things out of our control. experience intense emotions, and recognize the endurance of the human spirit.
With that, we have reached the part of our podcast where we turn to our club book audience for questions and comments for Emiko Jean and her work. In this book club, we like to encourage members and authors to connect and engage and help bridge the gap between the page you read and the process it took to write it. Our first question of the night comes from an audience member wondering about the location setting of Long Beach.
It's south of the Olympic Peninsula, but it's probably like a 2 or 3 hour drive, but you have to take over this bridge, a floating bridge too, that would also be washed out if this tsunami occurred. And so it's kind of this really interesting trek, and it feels like you're going like a long way away when it's really just about an hour. But I thought it was just so interesting that if this big earthquake came, that everything would just be underwater. I mean, this town would be totally decimated by it because there's no elevation to it either. So there's really no high ground that you can seek if there was a big tsunami to come.
This audience member asks if Emiko Jean will share her story of being arrested in high school.
I wasn't a great student when I was in high school, and I think I was just really lost. I was one of a handful of Asian American students in the town that I was, and I was really looking for friends and everything, and I stole something from Meyer and Frank. Do you guys remember Meyer and Frank? It's now Macy's. So they got bought out and turned into Macy's, and I stole sunflower perfume. And I remember, I think I was being clocked the entire time I was in the store because I had security, and they handcuffed me and they perp walked me through the whole store, which I thought that was a lot. And then there was like 5 cops that showed up, which it must have been like a slow day. But anyways, so I had to go to like teen court and everything like that. So it was my mom. She didn't know what to do with me. She was so devastated.
This question is about Emiko Jean's identity and how that wove into her journey to become a writer.
Growing up, we have to go kind of all the way back to my childhood. Growing up, I loved reading, and my mom was a reading specialist. We'd go to the library, and you could check out as many books as you could carry. And so I remember my arms, like the heaviness of carrying these big stacks of books out of the library. But I never read a book when I was little that featured an Asian American character or was by an Asian American author. And I was asked on a panel many years ago when was the first time I saw myself in any type of media, and it was when I was 16 when the Disney movie Mulan came out. I hadn't realized that until I was asked that very specific question. But then it kind of all crystallized for me how I had been erased from the space that I love so much, the space of literature. So I went on, throughout high school and college, and reading was always a safe space for me, but it wasn't a space that I saw myself actually being able to make a career out of. So I worked a variety of different jobs. On my bio, if you read it, it says like I was a candle maker, I was a florist, I did all sorts of weird stuff. And I think I was trying to find something that suited me and something that fulfilled me. And I was working a job that I was desperately unhappy at. And I hated it so much. And I remember I would pretend to be writing emails, but I'd really be typing chapters of a book. And yeah. And that was the first time that I remember writing and enjoying it and it being an outlet for me. And it really filled me up in a way something hadn't before. And the book was terrible. And I tried to get an agent with it and I tried to get it published, but it was super terrible, which was good. And I wouldn't want it to be published now. But that was the first time that I really decided to try to make a go out of it. And so, of course, because I had to be dramatic about it, I quit my job. And I didn't have anything else lined up. I just quit, and I made this big announcement to my family, I'm gonna write books now. And I remember my mother-in-law was very worried. But So I wrote another book, and that eventually became We'll Never Be Apart. And that first book I wrote had a white protagonist in it, because I didn't really think that I was going to be published if I featured someone that looked like me. And then once I had that book under my belt, there was the We Need Diverse Books movement that came into play, and it really gave me the courage to, and also I felt a responsibility to kind of represent myself in different types of narratives. And that's from that point on afterward, I was just more intentional with how I cast the characters of my book. I wanted them to look like me. They don't all have experiences like I do, but I wanted to explore what it means to be a yellow body in America. And so that's kind of what I've done now. And I feel like also it's important to do it in different genres too. So we have I've written these YA ones that are romantic and that are kind of these modern day fairy tales, and then I wrote one about transracial adoption. And in The Return of Ellie Black, Chelsey Calhoun is Japanese American, but this isn't really a book about her identity. It's more about a book about her service to women, to finding lost girls, but it does definitely contribute to the lens in which she sees and interprets the world.
Our next question is about the difference in writing from diverse perspectives in the YA market compared to the adult market.
So I have found it to be very different. I find the YA community and publishers in general to be a little more open and much more fearless. I think, with young adult books, they're so interesting because, again, there's an openness to them. Like, you could have, a gay space opera cowboy romance or something, and there's just so much more permission to explore. And that's still why I love young adult and while I'll continue to write it. But there hasn't been, the floodgates haven't quite opened in the same way in the adult market. And I do find myself still kind of acting as a trainer for diversity sometimes when I'm working with adult titles and trying to figure out, with the publisher ways to position it. I remember with Mika in real life, it was cataloged as Asian American fiction. And I felt like that was kind of unfair because it immediately kind of categorizes a book as an other rather than a story that can relate to a lot of different people. And so I remember that being disappointing and kind of having some back and forth with it. So yeah, it's hard, it's difficult. It accesses different parts of my brain's writing in both of those areas. And so I find it pretty easy to swing back and forth. And I have a couple books now under my belt, so it feels very natural and organic now. But it really does come down to the voice and also kind of the themes and experiences that the person is having. I enjoy young adult because it's like reliving my teenage years, and there's something just so fun and always so fresh about it. And it feels also very cyclic at times because I feel like we go through these, every 10 years, we kind of go through these identity things where we're kind of questioning who we are and our places in the world. And so it's nice to come back to that every so often. But with adult, you get to explore heavier themes. And for example, with Mika in real life, I wrote it and it was a book about motherhood, and I had just become a mother, which is just better suited for an adult audience.
This Club Book audience member asks if there will be more Chelsey Calhoun novels.
Yeah, so this book was actually bought in another 2-book deal, which I swore I would never do again after that first 2-book deal where I had one passed on. I drove my agent crazy for years and years because I was like, we're only selling full manuscripts, I'm never doing another 2-book deal. And but then I went, of course. I sold this one on a 2-book deal. But so I actually just finished it, and I'm waiting to hear back from my editor on it. But it does follow Chelsey Calhoun, who's the detective. So she moves on to new crime, new partner. I'm looking forward. Hopefully, never say never, but hopefully it makes it into your hands, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with everyone.
Our next question is if Emiko Jean thought that her book might never be published.
I pretty much had kind of resigned myself to always loving it alone. And because I would go back periodically to my agent and be like, is it time for this book? And Then when COVID hit, I was like, oh wow, this is like never going to happen. But I always believed in it, and I feel like there were little signs along the way. Like I remember talking to a writer early on who was a young adult writer, and I had gone to this conference. And I was still so upset about the book being passed on, and I remember I told him, like, it's, you know, I'm just so sad, and he said, well, it's probably pretty good if they didn't want it. And I don't know why that stuck with me, but I felt so encouraged by that. I think I was just looking for anything at that point, but yeah, I mean, there were times when I didn't think that it was going to be published, but it kind of gets back to like the root of writing. And you know, when you start a book, you really start it for yourself, and it doesn't. There's kind of this really beautiful thing where it only belongs to you, and that's kind of what I loved about it for so long. Was it was kind of my secret, and it belonged to me. And after having books published and having them out there and having them judged, it was nice to have something that was just for me.
This fan inquires what's next for Emiko Jean.
I actually just finished a young adult, and I have I'm revising it right now because I turned it into my editor, and it's about it's in the same kind of, keep hitting this microphone, sorry. It's in the same arena as kind of the Tokyo Ever After books in the sense that it's kind of this fun romantic comedy. And the YA book is about a girl who has stopped believing in love after her parents' divorce, and she begins to receive love notes from the future from her one true love. And it makes her believe in love again. It was really fun to write. It's nice to go back and forth, so I kind of write these like really dark thrillers, these really heavy thrillers, and then I'm ready to kind of write something lighter and more fun. Not that thrillers aren't fun, but different types of fun. You know, and young adult can really vary from anything like 12. I'm looking at the young adult bookseller in the audience. Yeah, there's a big range to it, and so it can be very clean, or you can go upper young adult. And I've kind of I think the Tokyo Ever After books I would kind of term more at the lower age range for young adult. But this new one that I have coming out, I'm hoping it has a little bit more crossover appeal, so probably like 17 and up. It's going to be a little bit spicier, yeah.
Another audience member wonders what Emiko Jean is reading.
Inevitably, I always get asked that, and then I freeze like a deer in the headlights because I'm like, I don't know what I'm reading. I read like a lot of different books at once. There's one, I don't know, can I swear on this podcast? Okay, sure. It's a title of a book. It's called Dear Dickhead. I don't know. It was like. I think it was originally published in France, and it's like it's all letters going back and forth. And I've been interested in like what is it called, epistolary fiction, since I've been writing this YA book with letters. So I started writing that, and it's really funny. I read a science fiction book called Annie-Bot, which came out a few months ago. It was super good, super surprising. I usually don't read a lot of science fiction because I feel like I'm not smart enough for it, but it was really great, and it was kind of this like exploration about like what it means to be human and what it means to be a woman, and like power dynamics within relationships, and I flew through that. And then since I just got done writing the follow-up to The Return of Ellie Black, I read this book called If Love Could Kill. It was a fiction book, a nonfiction book, but it's about why women kill. Which was really interesting and super dark. I read it like I had to read like one chapter at a time, but I just finished that, and it was really great, and it gave me a lot of ideas. Not personally, to clarify, for my fictional work. I should clarify that. Yeah.
A middle school teacher in the audience asked Emiko Jean about her experience being an underrepresented student growing up.
A little about me, a little about my past. I grew up with parents that grew up in the wake of the civil rights movement, and so the idea behind race in that was that you ignore it, and that love doesn't see any color. And so when I was growing up, I was encouraged not to think or talk about race and about who I was. So a lot of that was suppressed when I was growing up. And I think that made me very confused and super angry. And so my one piece of advice is to have those conversations with your students and not be afraid to discuss race and identity. I wish that it had been discussed earlier with me. I understand why it wasn't discussed in my house. Along with growing up in the wake of the civil rights movement, my dad is Japanese, and so there was the internment that we grappled with too. And so there was this, it was about keeping us safe as well and not talking about race or identity. And so when I was called things in middle school and in elementary school, I was encouraged to ignore it. And you can imagine what that would do to someone, to a student, to a child, if you're just like pushing that down all of the time. And it really, it really can bifurcate you. So again, I would just encourage you to have those conversations and reach out and not be afraid to talk about it.
Our last question of the night comes from an audience member wondering about the research process for writing The Return of Ellie Black.
So I was really fortunate to interview detectives who connected me with the victims that have returned. They all asked to stay anonymous and to have their stories stay anonymous, writing this book. And I certainly don't want to tell them because I don't want to be co-opting their stories. But in terms of the trauma and the processes, that's kind of what I focused in on them, is more that kind of like what happens afterward, like how do you, because that's something that I grappled with in the book, was how do I take Ellie from this place that she's been in and kind of how does she figure out how to find like hope afterward. And that's what I wanted to leave the novel at. I think there's a line at the end of the book where I say like she's going to learn how to carry the grief in one hand and hope in the other. And that's essentially what I learned from a lot of these victims, is that that will always be there, but they can also find light again too. It was really interesting. It was. I'm trying to think of the right word here. I'm a writer without words, but in speaking to these victims, it was at once the most like heartbreaking and enlightening thing that I've probably ever experienced. Yeah.
That wraps up our St. Paul Public Library event with Emiko Jean. Make sure to catch our next podcast with Jasmine Guillory. Rom-com queen Jasmine Guillory burst onto the romance scene in 2018 with The Wedding Date, the first installment in her loosely connected book series of the same name. Her other smash hits to date include The Proposal and Drunk on Love. Visit us online at clubbook.org for details on past and present seasons, sign up for our e-newsletter, check out our calendar, and so much more. Stay up to date with all of our events at our Club Book Facebook page. If you're on Twitter, find us using the handle ClubBookMN. And if you enjoy these free Club Book events and podcasts, remember to share them with your friends. They just may too. Thanks again to all those who make Club Book possible, including Melsa, Library Strategies, and Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Our sponsors include Red Balloon Bookshop, where you can purchase all the books featured in Club Book. Finally, a very special thank you to all the libraries hosting events this season. That's it for Club Book, the coolest club in town. We'll see you at the library.